Good evening and welcome on behalf of the Partnership of Historic Bostons. My name is Sid Levitsky and I'm a member of the board of the partnership. Please note that this event is being recorded and will appear on our website. First, a little background of who we are. The Partnership of Historic Bostons was first formed in 1999 as a joint project between the city of Boston, Massachusetts, and Boston, Lincolnshire, England, where many of the early Puritans emigrated from. The purpose of the partnership, as indicated by this evening's program, is public history. Each year, a specific aspect of the 17th century Boston is chosen, and a program of lectures, tours, and book and document discussion groups is established. The formal lectures occur in the fall and are specified as Charter Day, which commemorates the naming of Boston, Dorchester, and Watertown on September 7th, 1630. This year's topic is titled The Common Good, Who's Common? And this is the fourth lecture in the series. After the lecture this evening, we will have an opportunity for questions for the speaker. Please use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our speaker this evening is Professor Robert J. Allison. He is a professor of history at Suffolk University and teaches at Harvard University Extension School. He received both a master's and a PhD from Harvard University under the auspices of Professor Bernard Bailyn, with whom he co-edited a book on the Constitution. Professor Allison has written numerous books on the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the history of the Revolution. The Boston Massacre is one of my favorites. In reality, he is Boston's public historian par excellence, encompassing his teaching activities at Harvard, where I've taken several courses with him. He's also on the chair of the advisory committee, Revolution 250, a consortium of Boston history organizations, president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, to name only a few of his public service activities. Tonight, Professor Allison will speak on the Boston Common, America's oldest park. Bob?
Thank you very much, Sid, for that. I'm never quite sure with Dr. Levitsky how the introduction will go. I have to say, in my years of teaching, either at the Extension School or at Suffolk, I've only had one student who has decided to review one of my books and given it a critical review, and that's Dr. Levitsky. So I really admire his honesty and candor. And I'd also like to say I'm also an alumnus of the Harvard Extension School, and I'm delighted to see a number of my students here with us tonight. And I also want to thank the Partnership of the Historic Bostons for the really incredible work you've done over the last several decades to keep this history alive. I mean, it's really a privilege for historians like me to be able to have folks who really care about history, who come from all walks of life and are really engaged with the subject. So it's really always a joy to work with the Partnership for the Historic Bostons, and may you long continue. And I was asked this evening to say a few words about a subject we probably all know a lot about, and that is Boston Common. And Boston Common has been central to the town of Boston really since the founding. And even before that, I apologize, I just did something wrong. Of course, it was home, when this area was home to the Massachusetts people, it was part of their everyday lives, particularly in the summer months. A fish weir that was built, but that they built in the back bay and somewhere between what's now Kenmore Square and Boston Common sustained them over the course of several thousand years. And they, of course, also rebuilt it. It's one of the amazing stories about this structure, which was there and every year would be maintained. I think there are very few things that we have maintained for 100 years, 500 years. And here this structure was being rebuilt, replenished so that the fish could continue to sustain the Massachusetts people here on the shore of the Shawmut Peninsula in the place called Cohasset. here are some of the artifacts that the city archaeologist found in the area of the Frog Pond. And at the top of your screen, I believe you see number 2, is perhaps the oldest object ever found in Boston. It dates somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, I believe, and it's a point. One of the reasons more artifacts from that antiquity haven't been found is because the sea level was much lower. So this would have been a high ground before the sea levels rose and Boston became a peninsula. So that's as part of the story, of course, of the people who were here. And then the other part is the people who arrived in 1630. And of course, there already was an Englishman here when the Puritans arrived in the late summer of 1630. And that was the Reverend William Blackstone, who had come here on an earlier expedition. He was a chaplain from the Church of England. And when the expedition to Wessagusset broke up, he decided to stay in the area. And he built a house near a spring on the side of the Shawmut Peninsula, looking out over what we now know as Boston Common. And the spring, by the way, you can still hear if you go up the street onto Beacon Hill and look under the sewer, that this is where the Reverend Blackstone built his house. And he had, by tradition, a white ox. He liked to ride around the perimeter of the peninsula, and he could trade with the native people for other things he needed. He had his books, and he seemed to be happy here until in the summer of 1630, 1,200 Puritans arrived. And the Reverend Blackstone said he had left England to get away from the Lord's bishop, and he found he didn't like the Lord's brethren any better. So he took off for Rhode Island, and he sold Boston Common, this area, to the Puritan community for 30 pounds. And the community decided to tax every householder 6 shillings so that they could purchase the common and then leave it as a common area. It's something of a misnomer to call it the oldest public park in the country because it wasn't a park. The Puritans were very pragmatic and unsentimental people, and the idea of a leisure place would be completely foreign to them. So this is a common area used for utilitarian purposes, a place to train the militia and a place to graze your cattle or sheep. Each householder could have 1 cow on the common until there got to be too many, and then the limit was set at 70 cows. But in lieu of a cow, you could have 4 sheep. And also the rule was each of the cows had to be a milking cow. You could not have a dry cow or a young cow or a horse on the common. And the town hired, or the keepers, the folks who had the livestock hired a keeper of cows who was paid 2 shillings per cow, and also a shepherd. After 1646, no one who arrived was allowed to keep a cow on the common unless they hired the right from them that are commoners, that is, those who were already part of this. And it's at that point that the real cattle grazing area became Noddle's Island, what is today East Boston, or Hog Island in the harbor. And we can see this common area, because it belonged to everyone, it also belonged to no one. That is, whose responsibility is it? And we see a series of ordinances the town passed in 1652, an ordinance requiring that the entrails or the parts of a cow or a beast or a fowl couldn't be left on the ground, nor could people simply leave garbage or dead dogs or dead cats on the ground. And the town charged that people had been annoying the common by spreading stones or laying carrion upon it. And there's a charge that people were building lots and were casting their stones on the common. And the phrase they used was annoying the common by throwing trash on it. And in 1657, the fine was 20 shillings for annoying the common by throwing trash on it. So we have the Reverend Blackstone, and here, of course, the famous founding monument put up almost 100 years ago now to commemorate the founding of Boston, with Governor Winthrop in the center and Reverend Blackstone, who actually was modeled on James Michael Curley greeting Winthrop to his town. And behind the Reverend Blackstone are 2 native people. And it shouldn't, it should make us think less about how this was marked in 1930 than how we will mark the founding of Boston in 2030, which will be here sooner than we know. And of course, the Partnership for the Historic Bostons has done great work to prepare us all for thinking how we will commemorate what has happened. So the Common is a grazing area, a military area, and in all of these maps, from the earliest maps are from the early 1700s, one feature is this great elm, the one tree on this common. The common faced west, and it would have gotten the wind from the west, the winds across the back bay and coming down from the northwest. And this great elm was already there when the Puritans arrived in 1630. And they were, as I said, and I shouldn't tell this group what the Puritans were like. And I know I'm really dreading now the question period when I'll be called to account for it. But a tree for them was, again, something to use. They would build houses with trees or build ships with trees. Or in this case, this tree found a use in being a place for public executions for the malefactors who ran afoul of the law. And some, of course, were for crimes which we still consider to be criminal offenses, and others were less so. Here's another view of the Common. This is probably from the 1700s, looking from one of the hills just to the north, what we would call Beacon Hill or Mount Pemberton, or the furthest west one. And looking down, you can see beyond the Common, the settlement of the South End, and further you can see Dorchester Neck, those peaks there. And to the right, you can see the waters of the Back Bay, which water rushed right up to the Common. And it was one reason it became a dumping ground, because of course, if you don't have land to dump on, you'll dump things in the water. So the great tree, of course, is the central feature of it. And actually further down, you can see another tree, and that's the area of Park Square. You know, the Common really extended from what is today the granary to Park Square. Today it's 50 some acres in the middle, much of it having been preserved, but a larger area for grazing and for military training and for the other purposes. Another view from the 1700s of the Common, and again, a couple of the cattle there. By the way, as I said, they really clamped down on cattle quite early on, so only 70 were permitted there. And cattle were forbidden on the Common in 1830. There still may have been a few. And actually, in the long turn of affairs, the relationship between Native people and the English, the cattle probably did more damage than anything. My friend Virginia Anderson has written about the livestock invasion, and how this transforms not only the natural landscape, but the ways of life. But as I said, in 1930, cattle were forbidden from the Common. So if you've had a real estate agent telling you that your place on Beacon Hill still has access rights for your cattle to go to the Common, be very skeptical. So we have the Common, and here, of course, is the great elm, which remains until the time of the Civil War. And in the 1860 or so, it's badly damaged in a storm, and then in the 1870s, completely knocked down. It's now, there's a plaque marking the spot where this great elm stood, and it would have been a great elm at the time of the Puritan arrival. And of course, one of the most famous executions is that of Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker. I'm not going to talk about the other criminal offenses that could bring you to the gallows in Boston. And I also should note, there is some historical controversy about where exactly the Quakers were executed. There was another gallows on what it was Boston Neck, now the South End, near where the South End burying ground is. And in fact, the South Bay was called Gallows Bay. And those who insist that that's where the Quakers had were executed are very adamant about it. And so I don't want to get into a dispute. There's evidence on both sides, and we know people were hanged from the great elm. And I'm not telling this simply because I'm talking about the Common and so wanted to get this in, but Mary Dyer was a Quaker, and of course, being a Quaker was against the law in Massachusetts, as well as in the Plymouth colony. In fact, in Plymouth, I believe the penalty for entertaining a Quaker was a fine of 200 pounds. And I don't know how many of us would entertain a Quaker at that cost. And Mary Dyer was from Boston. She was a friend of Anne Hutchinson, and the inner light spoke to her. And so she came to Boston, which was her home. Her husband, her family were here, and she professed her faith in the inner light and the Society of Friends, and was found guilty of this, along with two others, Marmaduke Stevenson, who was a Yorkshireman, and William Robinson, who was a London merchant. And the three of them, on the 27th of October of 1659, were led to the gallows, either the Great Elm or the South End, where they were one by one to be hanged. And according to the story, the rope was hung from the limb of the tree, and then the rope would be put around the neck of the person being executed, who then would climb a ladder. They would be blindfolded. They would climb a ladder, and then the ladder would be turned out, and the person then cast into eternity. And here you see the scene as they are marched with under a military procession. And in fact, there was a drummer on either side of them to prevent anything they say from being heard by the crowd that had gathered to see the execution. And apparently the Reverend John Wilson was on hand to taunt them. But all three of them went with great dignity to their execution. And Stevenson was the first to be hanged, and then Robinson as one by one. So Mary Dyer is standing there watching as her two colleagues are being executed. And then it is her turn, and she is loaned a handkerchief to bundle over her eyes. And then she climbs the ladder, having prepared for her final moments. And then her son arrives with a reprieve. The governor has reprieved her, and she is surprised. And it takes her a few minutes to compose herself to understand whether she should accept the pardon or whether she should go to eternity, which she was prepared to do. What is it the Lord would have her do? And she does finally decide to accept the pardon. So she steps down, the noose is untied, and she is banished. And she is banished to Rhode Island. But then the inner voice, within just a few months, tells her to come back. And she does. And in May of 1660, she's back in Boston. And then on the 1st of June, is executed on Boston Common. And of course, now her statue is on the State House lawn. It's a striking thing to me that someone who is executed by the authority of what becomes the government of the Commonwealth now is memorialized in front of the State House. But here she is, an eternal witness to us of this episode. And there's another Quaker executed in 1661. In fact, as you probably know, in the 1670s and 80s, Massachusetts's execution of Quakers is one of the reasons the Crown takes away the charter, because of course Massachusetts Bay was a company and not a province, and the British government didn't understand, the English government didn't understand a private corporation having the power to put people to death for the same offense for which the king was giving William Penn a tract of land in Pennsylvania. So the last Quaker was executed in 1661 on the Common. There were other executions for people who committed other offenses, which we don't need to discuss here. So the Common has this very utilitarian purpose. You can see on this map a powder house and a watch house. You'd want the powder house to be far enough away from the settlement so that if the powder caught fire, it wouldn't damage anything. So this would be a good place for a powder house, the middle of the Common, actually on the hill, probably the hill that now holds the Civil War Memorial would be where the powder house was, the highest point on Boston Common. And you can see the frog pond on this. There were 3 ponds on the Common at this time. And ponds, of course, were ideal for watering cattle. And again, along what is now the Tremont Street, you can see a line of trees that were planted in the early 1700s. As we're beginning to see the transformation of the Common into something more park-like, I guess, for want of a better word, along what is now Tremont Street. And you can see how the Common extends from the burying place at the granary, down to almost to Frog Lane. In fact, in the early 1700s, those parcels along Frog Lane, what is now Boylston Street, also become part of the Common. And the oblong area is now the burying ground, the central burying ground of the Common. So more park-like, but also different uses. This is an area on the outskirts of town, And all kinds of things seem to happen here. In one of the Silence Do-Good papers, a young apprentice, Benjamin Franklin, writes about, under the guise of Silence Do-Good, writes about perambulating through the streets late at night and the astonishing things seen here in this very Puritan town. He has a set of ramblers who accost him. And I had no sooner left this set of I should say her, because this is Silence Do-Good writing. I had no sooner left this set of ramblers, but I met a crowd of tarpaulins and their doxies. Tarpaulins would be sailors, and linked to each other by the arms, who ran, by their own account, at the rate of 6 knots an hour, bent their course towards the common. Their eager and amorous emotions of body, occasioned by taking their mistresses in tow, they called wild steerage. So what Silence Do-Good sees here is perambulating the town late at night, sailors and prostitutes heading for the common with this in wild steerage. In fact, the next paragraph talks about the ladies he sees walking the streets, looking one way and another, sizing up potential customers. And it's not, I think, what you would expect of this Puritan town, unless, like those of us in the Partnership for the Historic Boston, we spend a lot of time with the 17th century in this world. And we understand why the Winthrop and the Puritans prayed so much. They understood human depravity. Just a few years after the Silence Do-Good piece, there's a proposal from an English writer that Boston should put a statue of Pocahontas on Boston Common. And this person had apparently read William Byrd's History of Virginia or Robinson's History of Virginia and was entranced with the story of Pocahontas, who of course is not from here, but from Virginia, had become something of a heroine in John Smith's accounting, as well as in her own visit to London. And this anonymous writer, imagine this, 1734, there weren't any statues in Boston. And the Puritans didn't really see this representation of people as something that they favored. And so a statue of Pocahontas would have been not only the only statue of a native person in Boston, but the only statue at all in Boston. And it's not until the 20th century, I think, that we get a statue of a woman in Boston. But here is someone in 1734 telling the Bostonians, to show yourselves the most elegant of all settlements, you should subscribe for her statue to set up in the beautiful places of the public walks where your company meet. So the public walks, of course, were the common, and this is where the company meets, probably a more genteel company during the day, and then, of course, the sailors and the ladies of the evening at night. But here a statue of Pocahontas would enliven life for both. It's probably not surprising that Bostonians don't come forward in 1734 or thereafter to subscribe for a statue for Pocahontas. The one I'm showing here is actually in England, near her burying place. The Common's also used for religious gatherings. In the 1740s, the Reverend George Whitefield preaches on the Common. He had been scheduled to preach at the Old South Meeting House, but so many people turned out to hear him that one of the balconies collapsed, and the people in the rush to get out of this disaster, a number were crushed to death. So preaching on the Common was much safer, not only for Whitefield, whose voice could carry over acres, but for those coming to hear him preach. And toward the end of the century, standing under the great elm, Jesse Lee, who was really one of the pioneers of American Methodism, preached on the Common. One reason Whitefield and Lee are preaching outdoors is churches, established pulpits, were reluctant to let these evangelists preach. And Methodism was under kind of a heavy burden in the late 18th century from Congregationalists. I'm not here to reopen old wounds of the struggle between Methodists and Congregationalists. But you have Jesse Lee preaching actually under the great elm. He knew the significance of the great elm, and what better place to preach than under this great elm. And in addition to preaching, we also have the Common becoming a final resting place. It's the central burying ground. It's opened after the one that's at King's Chapel, which we should not call the King's Chapel burying ground. I know if I said that, someone would correct me, and the Granary and Copp's Hill. As those burying grounds become too crowded, the central burying ground is open. And among the notable folks buried there are William Billings, who is probably the father of American choral music. And he's a lector or a choir master in a number of the Boston churches, although he's somewhat obscure during his lifetime because most Bostonians knew him as a tanner. That was his day job during the week to support himself. And he had a large family. And being a choir master was something of a hobby, which allowed him to produce 4 volumes of choral music, which are really extraordinary. And here you see, this is purportedly an engraving, or actually a Paul Revere engraving of Billings leading a group in singing one of his carefully wrought psalm tunes. And another person buried there is Gilbert Stuart, the artist, who's probably best known for his portrait of George Washington at Dorchester Heights, as well as other notable portraits. I think for me, one of the most poignant burials, though, is of a man known to us as Chow Mandarin, who is, as you can see by his gravestone, a native of China. And he had come to Boston in 1798 on a ship. And he falls off one of the masts in Boston Harbor and dies. And the ship owner, who had gotten to know and love Chow Mandarin, is so wrought, he puts up this marker on his grave in the burying ground. And apparently there were many more people buried in the burying ground than were known. And when a Boylston Street was widened and the subway was built underneath, it turns out the burying ground extended far beyond the walls. And I should also mention that those who were executed on the Common, for whatever reason, would be buried close to the tree or close to the site of execution. So if the archaeologist ever has reason again to go digging in the Common, they will find a lot of fascinating, they'll disinter a lot of fascinating people. Now, in the 19th century, we see the Common beginning its transformation into a park. This is a late 1780s engraving showing the view of John Hancock's house, looking up really from Tremont Street up to Beacon Hill. And you see some livestock grazing there and some trees, the fence probably to keep the livestock in, but also it's a walkway with that line of trees along the promenade, or the mall as it's called, along the edge of what is now Tremont Street. And here during the Revolutionary War, this is a famous prospect of the Common with the British troops mustering on it. Again, the military use of the Common was always one. The militia would train there, the British troops camped there. And of course, on the night of the 18th of April of 1775, the British troops left from the shore of the Common to cross the Back Bay to Lexington and Concord. And then we see that military use continuing even as the Common is being transformed into a park. Here we have mid-19th century, the Boston Lancers, I believe, parading on the Common. And in fact, into the 20th century, the schoolboy parade. Schoolboys in Boston would form drill teams, and they always would have their final parade to the Common. A great training area for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of military purposes. And of course, the first Monday of June is still the annual muster of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, who have been mustering since the 1630s. And here is the Washingtonian Convention on Boston Common. This was a temperance society gathering on Boston Common in a convention, a common area big enough to accommodate a crowd like this, just to have been able to accommodate the congregation coming to hear Whitfield or coming to hear Jesse Lee or coming to attend an execution. It can also accommodate gatherings like this one. And this is one of the great events in Boston's history was in 1848 when the Cochituate water pipe opened and spouted a stream of water 40 feet high into the air, really signaling the development of a better water system in Boston. You can see the Common being part of all of these civic events in the life of Boston, Boston as a town, Boston as a city. And this is probably a good time to point out, the Common does not belong to the city of Boston. It is, of course, maintained by the Parks Department, but the common belongs to the citizens of Boston. Those householders who paid their 6 shillings or 30 shillings back in 1634 purchased it. They did not bestow it on the town. There are ordinances in the town forbidding the town to sell any of the land. And there have been times when the city of Boston or different entities with an interest in the common have wanted to divert it from its purpose of simply being a common area. And this has usually been met with really an angry reaction from the citizens of Boston to whom it belongs. That is, it's ours, it's not the city government's. And here a beautiful rainbow over the common, as if to signify that the common belongs to all of us and not to a city. I didn't mean to turn this into a political diatribe. I love the city of Boston and its government. Just let me say that. This isn't being recorded, is it? No, okay.
It is.
Okay. So also, eminent visitors come to the common as being part of Boston. This is where you would be feted, on the common. So in 1824, and again in 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette visits the common. And in fact, the mall along Tremont Street, where the trees had been planted, this elegant pathway, is renamed in his honor, the Lafayette Mall. And by the way, it's also at this time that the city thinks, as we're renaming things, why not rename the common, which is simply the common, Washington Park? That is, we want it to be a park, and why not name it for Washington? There must have been a debate over this, but suffice it to say, we call it the common, and it did not become Washington Park. Although at this time, what had been Century Lane becomes Park Street. That is the street that the sentries would have gone up and down as they were patrolling, now is Park Street. And then at the other end of the common, Park Square, really connotes this time when we were thinking of this more as a park than as a common land. And the gentleman on the bottom was known on his visit here as Lord Renfrew. He was the Prince of Wales, who visited in the late 1850s and later becomes King Edward VII. And in fact, he's part of a military parade on the common where he reviewed the various militia companies. And remember, this is a year before the Civil War, so there may be some expectation of military conflict. I suspect probably not as much as we historians would imagine. People usually don't see trouble coming until it's here. But in this case, Lord Renfrew, he did not bring his own horse. He rode on a horse called Black Prince that belonged to a local. And later on, Black Prince was used as a model of the horse on whom Washington sits in the public garden. So Lafayette, the destroyer of monarchies who fought against the British Empire, celebrated on the common. And so, of course, is Lord Renfrew, the descendant of George III and the future king of Great Britain. And also on the common is hosted Black Hawk, Native American, who led his people to war against the Americans in the 1820s, 1830s, and what's known as Black Hawk's War. One of the most interesting and most effective acts of Indian resistance of the 19th century. And then after the war, Black Hawk is treated as something of a hero, and he comes to Boston and is celebrated on the common. And so, of course, is Andrew Jackson, the president who visits Boston in 1836. And in fact, Mayor Josiah Quincy, actually now president of Harvard, Josiah Quincy, is Jackson's host, as Jackson does receive an honorary degree from Harvard, much to the consternation of some of the Harvard alumni who are not Jackson supporters. And Jackson, of course, Indian fighter, celebrated on the common, as is Black Hawk. It's one of the fascinating things about the common is it does belong to everyone, and we have widely divergent views of those who will use and enjoy it. It's also on the common in the 1850s that Ralph Waldo Emerson tries to tutor young Walt Whitman. Emerson really admired Whitman's poetry. And in fact, he wrote to him, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career." But Emerson, like many other readers, was scandalized by some of the passages in Leaves of Grass that were thought to be obscene. And Emerson tries to convince Whitman to take these offensive passages out. In several hours of walking back and forth on the paths of the common, we can imagine these two great literary lights, literary minds, arguing about the nature of poetry, as well as the nature, I suppose, of obscenity and what would pass in polite society. And it's an argument that, as with the argument about renaming the common Washington Park, that Emerson loses and Whitman wins. Also, thinking about the common and its literary aspect, it's in 1926 that H.L. Mencken was arrested on Boston Common for selling an April issue of the American Mercury, which the New England Watch and Ward Society had declared to be obscene. And Mencken heard this and came to Boston to sell a copy of it, and he was promptly arrested. By the way, I went to the Athenaeum to see if I could see this offensive issue, and it's not there. It's not in the bound volume for 1926. I do actually have a copy of it, which I don't think I'm allowed to show anyone, because, as I said, the Watch and Ward Society found it to be, ultimately it's determined not to be. It's this Boston, I don't need to get sidetracked into literary Boston, but just thinking about the common, of course, makes us think of probably Boston's greatest literary export, other than Benjamin Franklin, is Edgar Allan Poe. And he doesn't really like Boston, is putting it much too mildly. He hated Boston, and he referred to Boston as Frogpondia. But I love this passage where he says that the hotels are bad, the pumpkin pies are delicious, their poetry is not so good. And remember, Poe is a literary critic. Their common, he says, is no common thing. And we could spend the rest of the night interpreting what Poe means by that. Their common is no common thing. And I don't think it is. And of course, it's not something you would see in other American towns, a common area. We have parks, but not a common, which is open to all. The duck pond might answer, he says, if its answer could be heard for the frogs. Again, Poe really didn't like the frog pond. And I think one characteristic of Bostonians, when we have something we know someone else doesn't like, we embrace it. So we embrace the frog pond, probably because Edgar Allan Poe made such a fuss about not liking it. And the frog pond is one of the great features of the common, the only remaining pond here. And of course, now it's been paved, and it's a wonderful place for recreation. This is a postcard from the early 20th century. And here is a painting of ice skaters on the common. Mayor Menino actually commissioned a painting of ice skaters on the frog pond, as his administration, I think, had helped to restore it. Most administrations that have been successful have spent time restoring the common, because something that gets such heavy use, open to the public, open to everyone, 24 hours a day, and people from all walks of life are going to use it, not just the genteel sorts like Dr. Levitsky and me, but all kinds of folks will use the common. And it gets its more than its share of wear and tear. And we've seen other activities on the common, I guess, to wean us from the duck pond and the frog pond. In the late 19th century, there was a deer park on the common. And these deer were in a pen near where the burying ground is, really between the burying ground and the Boylston Street station. There was a deer park where children from the city could go and look at the deer. And thinking about the commons past, when it was part of the Massachusetts range, that is, this would be a refuge for deer who then could swim to the island. So we're bringing back something that was once here. And then, of course, other recreational activities. It was unfortunate at the time Silence Dogood was writing that there weren't more organized sports and things, but here's a episode of sledding. And of course, there's a famous story about the schoolboys of Boston protesting to General Gage about their sledding path being obstructed. But again, sledding, go to the common on a winter day, you still are going to see kids sledding down the hill. And this, of course, is High Pole Hill, which is now where the Civil War Memorial is. And here, football. Football in one way begins on the common. Among schoolboys during the Civil War, the Oneida Club played on the common, and according to their marker, not only were they never defeated, no one ever scored against them. And for when I first moved to the city, this marker actually had a soccer ball, because sometime after the monument was installed in the 1920s, the thinking was they must not have meant what we think of as football. They must have meant what we think of as soccer. But subsequent research shows that yes, indeed, it was football. And the common is marked by the National Football Leagues, or the Football Hall of Fame, as one of the beginning places for the sport we know as football happening on the common. And then other things. Again, preaching continues on the common. And here is Martin Luther King in 1965 speaking at the Parkman Bandstand. This is the end of a march from Roxbury to downtown Boston. And here is Pope John Paul II, who visited in the late 1970s and preached a papal mass on Boston Common. This is the largest gathering ever held on Boston Common, the papal mass. And I am told that if that day you ventured up to the King's Chapel burying ground, to the Winthrop grave and other Puritan graves, you would have felt the spinning going on beneath the ground as the Pope was preaching, celebrating Mass on the Common. So the Common continues to be a place for the sacred, as it was for Whitefield, as it was for Jesse Lee and for Martin Luther King and the Pope, but also the profane. And here, Judy Garland. This was one of the largest, I believe, the largest performance ever held on the Common. 100,000 people came to hear Judy Garland sing in 1967 on Boston Common, and she charmed the city. And the Common also has seen its share of bad ideas. As I said, it belongs to everyone, and periodically someone with a stake or an interest in the city has what on the surface seems like a good idea. In retrospect, we can, of course, say a novena or a prayer to those who have preached or celebrated on the Common that these things did not happen, as well as to the citizens of Boston who objected. This was actually the public garden. And shortly after the death of Daniel Webster, when plans were being bruited about what to do with this land being created just west of the Common, someone thought the best use for it should be a massive statue of Daniel Webster in the center of the public garden. And you can see here the artist's vision of the admiring crowds coming to, well, I know there is a story about a golden calf that people are looking at, but I suppose I'm not putting this here in the hope that some Webster fanatics in the audience will want to revive this particular idea, but here it would have been if not for cooler heads. And then at the end of the Civil War, there was an idea, because we want to celebrate the end of war, and we'll have a huge celebration of peace. We'll build the Peace Pavilion on Boston Common. What better use for the Common than to celebrate the ending of the war? And this gets a boost when the Franco-Prussian War ends shortly thereafter. So we've ended all wars, and how better to celebrate than by building this structure, which again, didn't happen. It actually is built near Copley Square on land just being opened with the filling in of the Back Bay. I think we always have to be mindful of this, unless we say, boy, in the 19th century, they had some really bad ideas. Statue of Daniel Webster, a peace pavilion. Fairly recently, when the idea was presented of Boston hosting the Summer Olympics, the proposal was, well, the only place to have beach volleyball would be on Boston Common. And yes, it would require both cutting down many of the trees and building the stadium and also bringing in sand. I don't know if there would be any sand left on any of the beaches in our area, Revere Beach or Cape Cod, because it all would be on Boston Common to accommodate beach volleyball. Again, another idea I'm at least glad did not happen, but it didn't not happen because it was a bad idea. It didn't not happen because people cared about preserving the common, a common area for everyone. And so this does leave, I was just in the course of thinking about what I was going to say, I found an article from Boston Magazine, I think, just 2 years ago, lamenting the fact that the common hasn't changed at all since Paul Revere's time. So we really need to do something. And I think it's one of the great impetuses we have as people to think we should be doing something. And there are lots of things we can do to preserve the common. One is to keep it clean. Although my good friend Henry Lee, when he hears about archaeology on the common, suggests that we actually go out and throw champagne glasses on the ground so that future generations will think we're a higher class of people than they will find by looking at whatever trash may be found on the common today. But thinking about how we can preserve the common and thinking about all of those who have been part of its history. And here is Child Hassam's picture of Boston Common at twilight. And you see a mother and her children feeding the birds on this winter scene on the common, and Tremont Street just to the left, busy with traffic. But the common remains this tranquil place where we can get away from the busyness of our lives and be part of this natural world that was here long before we came, and we hope will be here long after we are gone. One of my favorite activities on the common is every June when the artist Ross Miller and school children rebuild the fish weir on the common and put it up and think about those who came before and those who have used it, and all of us who will continue to use it, and all of those who will come after us. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Allison. That was tremendous. Again, to the audience, please place your questions using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And as we gather our questions, I'm going to start with the first question. Obviously, I'm going to be focusing on the Puritan period. So allegedly, William Blackstone, sometimes referred to as William Blackstone, I keep seeing anything I read, they go back and forth, was the first English person to occupy Boston's Shawmut Peninsula in perhaps 1625 and build a house adjacent to the common. The question is, who gave Blackstone the right to settle and have title to the land, because he was able to sell off pieces of it at a later period when the Puritans came? Was it the Council of New England set up by James I in 1620, or is there no historical evidence of how he acquired the land?
That's a very good question. And there are two things here. One, the fact that the Council for New England also didn't own New England. I mean, he was here for an expedition to Wessagusset. That falls apart. There were a couple of these other English plantings here. They weren't really plantations in the sense of Plymouth was or Massachusetts Bay was. It was a trader. So David Thompson was on Thompson's Island. Samuel Maverick was in what is now Winnissimut and in Noddle's Island. And then Blackstone was here, but I believe he had come from Wessagusset. Now, the native people who were here had been devastated by this plague in the 16 teens, but were still coming to the harbor. I suspect, I don't know, and it would be worth looking into, and if someone here has done more research on this, I'd welcome this. Did he buy it from any of the native people? I mean, you would think he's here. There's an understanding that the land does belong to everyone. So yeah, Blackstone can settle there. He's not causing anyone any trouble. If the problem comes when 1,200 Puritans arrive. And then in the 1680s, at the time the British Crown is looking into how exactly all these people claim to own this territory, there's actually a flurry of purchases of land from native people. In the state archives, you can find lots of records of, you find the grandson of Chickatawbut and have him, say, sign these deeds to these various places. So we want to prove our ownership, because you can see, Sid, you asked a great question, and I'm actually going to be answering a different one and say further study is warranted on what happens with Blackstone or Blackstone. But the and now I've lost my train of thought temporarily, it will come back to me, but you have this purchasing of land. The English Crown, though, didn't recognize that these commons actually could be commons. And this is one of the things that brings the trouble in the 1680s with the Dominion of New England, with the Governor Andros saying, well, towns don't have commons. All land either belongs to the king or belongs to someone. So if it's open land, the king can sell it. And that is something that drives the resistance to Andros in the 1680s, is the attempt to sell commons. So other towns, Roxbury, Dorchester, Lynn, also had common land, would use for grazing and so on. I don't know. I'm sure that doesn't answer your question. It probably raised several others. So why don't you try the next one, Sid, and see if I do any better.
Oh, you've done very well. Some of the things that I've read about Blackston allude to the idea that he bought the land from the natives, but there's no evidence of the transaction, and whether that was fantasy or mythologizing at a later period of time, I'm uncertain. What about I'm going to ask a question was asked by Meredith Markowitz. Was the early rule about grazing 1 milk cow or 4 sheep similar to the other town commons? Was it universal, or was it only in Boston?
That's a very good question. And when I am invited to talk about the Dorchester Town Common, I will certainly address that. I don't know. I will say that most of the towns had a rule. There was a rule that you had to live within half a mile of the meeting house, which would mean in other towns, the grazing area wouldn't be in the center, but would be on the periphery. And so there you could have more cattle. I suspect one reason there's the limit in Boston is because the common is a finite area, and the cattle, the sheep, the hogs actually cause the most damage when they're wandering through the streets, are going to be a nuisance, which is why they're hiring a shepherd and hiring a keeper of cattle so that they won't cause that problem. But I suspect in other towns, the common area was more of a training field. The Charlestown, in fact, is still called the training ground. And the grazing area would have been on the outside. That's as near as I can guess. But again, I hope we're writing these questions down, because I think there are many books to be written about this, judging by the questions.
Okay, we have another question from Boris. I don't know whether it's a Mr. or Mrs. When was the common drained? Given that it was a fish weir earlier, the area must have been wet in many areas.
Okay, that's a very good question. The fish weir was in the middle of the Back Bay, so it wasn't on the common. The common, or on the shore of Kenmore Square, what is now Kenmore Square, is where the fish would have been dried. So the common always has been land. The sea level had risen to bring the water up to the shore of it. There were 3 ponds on the common, one of them under the Parkman Bandstand, one of them roughly, the Frog Pond, and then a third a little to the west. But the common itself always has been land. The ponds had been drained, but it's the Back Bay that is the big water area. I see a question popped up in the chat. How many acres is the common? I believe it's 54.
Okay. There's another question about the fencing around the common, the iron fencing.
Yes.
When was that put up?
That was also some was in the late 18th and others in the early 19th century. That's think about how old that iron fencing is. And in fact, if you're familiar with the gate at the corner of Charles and Beacon Street, there were similar gates on the other parts of the common. I mean, there had been earlier fences because you have livestock there. But this very decorative iron fence is a bit later in terms of the common's life, but kind of early in the terms of our life.
Was there an uproar when the parking garage was built? This is a question by Susan Wilson.
Good question. Actually, if you think about it, one of the other great literary pieces in our cultural history is Robert Lowell's poem For the Union Dead, which actually begins with the parking garage being built and Boston Common being dug up. Was there an uproar? I don't think, the city was different in the 1960s at this time. And it was, so parking was a thing. We wanted to be able to park. I would have to look into that. And I would also look to those who might have been around in the 1960s to remember this. But the fact that they're putting the parking garage underground is kind of a good thing. I wasn't going to put that on my list of things that were bad ideas, because A, you have the garage underground, and B, it does generate revenue for the Massachusetts Convention Center Authority. Not that I'm plugging the MCCA, but there are, I suppose, worse things to do. And someone asked if there were bodies found underneath. I don't know. I do know one thing, way the archaeologist gets to work is when they're putting in lampposts, and the lighting was actually put in the 1970s, early 80s. And of course, the Friends of the Public Garden and Friends of the Common have been pushing for lighting because there's a high crime area in the 1960s, 1970s. And the Common's gone through periods of being, a safe area and then being a not so safe area. Because I said, it's open to everyone. And high crime area. And one way to mitigate that was actually to put in lighting. And the person really responsible for getting that done, I'm told, was Senator Bolger, who was president of the state Senate, and also understood the importance of civic amenities like the Common. But you see periods of the Common being in good shape and in less good shape. But it depends. We want the city government to do it. The city government will point out it belongs to us, but we need to keep this as a focus for the city government, because you walk through the Common on any given day, you are going to see, I remember taking a group of my students to the Common, and my university happens to adjoin the Common, so they walk through it several times a day, and sometimes it's not a safe place. And so I said, okay, we're going to walk around the Common. They said, "Ooh, it's such a sketchy place." I said, "Everyone in Boston walks through the Common." They said, "No, we just see the sketchy people." I think that was the more polite word they were using. So there we were, and who should come along walking his dog but John Kerry. And I don't think they regarded him as a sketchy person, but it just illustrates the fact this is a meeting place for everyone. And I'm sorry, Sid, I can't remember your question now, but it was really a good one.
You were right on target. Sarah Stewart, the vice president of the partnership, reminds me that Thomas Green from the Massachusetts tribe says that, and I'm not pronouncing his name, Chickasaw, but agreed to occupancy, but not sale.
Yes.
To Blackston.
Okay.
And the differentiation is open to question in my mind.
Yes, thank you. A good point.
I'm going to ask another question, and that how accurate is the story that Blackston invited Winthrop and the Puritan immigrants from Charlestown, or was it Isaac Johnson, Lady Arbella's husband and a classmate of Braxton at Cambridge University? Who did the inviting? Was there any relationship, any letters or historical evidence?
I had always heard it was Lady Arbella and Isaac Johnson, and that they came over. I mean, there they are in Charlestown, and it's late summer, and so mosquitoes are a problem there. Plus, they don't have a good source of fresh water there. Plus, the problem of the wolves, because you remember the native population had been devastated by the plague, which meant the deer population had exploded, which also meant the predators other than people who would attack deer were proliferating. So think about these Puritans who arrived and they hear these wolves howling just off in the distance. And so Lady Arbella and Sir Isaac Johnson come to visit their old friend, the Reverend Blackston, and say, lousy water, mosquitoes, wolves. And he said, well, this is the Shawmut Peninsula, the place of living water. And so you should come over here. And so they do, and along come 600 other Puritans who weren't invited. And that's
John Winthrop.
and Governor Winthrop, who also recognizes this as Boston as the place for the main settlement, because it is central between Dorchester, Roxbury, Cambridge, Charlestown, centrally located. So the short answer is I had always heard it was the Johnsons and not Governor Winthrop.
Okay, I think we've run out of questions. So I'm going to thank you for this wonderful presentation. And before I close, I want to thank everyone for attending and remind everyone that we are a not-for-profit public history organization that appreciates donations to cover our expenses, and that donations can be made on our website, historicbostons.org. In addition, a video of tonight's session will be available via YouTube on our website. And in addition, there is a list of resources and readings on our website. And finally, please fill out the post-event survey that you will receive by email. And again, thank you, Professor Allison, for a magnificent talk. And thank you for the audience in participating, and good night.
Thank you very much.